agenda for the G20. At the end of the day, Alok, since you said that what we're looking at is a success of medium to long term here, at the end of the day, is there a need for a social agenda?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, the agenda, see, as if you look at it from a G20 perspective, you already have an existing, social, or let us say a development agenda in existing, institutions. For instance, largely the MDBs, the UN organizations, they're already grappling with it. The issue is, what is the G20 bringing anything new to the table? In fact, just before Korea introduced the development agenda, you had this comprehensive growth commission report where you had a number of Nobel laureates coming together and putting together in one document what works and what does not work as far as development is concerned. So I think a question which we are really struggling with is, what is the G20 bringing to the table? And if you ask me personally, I'm a little disappointed. I thought what they could bring to the table was resources. And that is something which the G20 has been shying away of, being ambitious enough in raising the resources for development on the scale which were raised, let us say, in post-war Europe through the same institutions like the World Bank. So, and there is some degree of self-interest involved there as well for the G20, because there is a talk that you need new nodes of growth to develop to get the global economy back on a high growth track. That if demand in developed countries and growth there is falling, to sort of get global growth up, you need to rebalance demand and get growth going in new nodes, and you need huge amounts of resources for it. But so far that has not happened.
That's interesting that you should point out, because of course India seems to be at the hub of so much, whether it was Cannes or whether it was Seoul before that. I'd like to bring on our next speaker, the Director General of FICCI, Rajiv Kumar. I remember you saying in an interview, I think just before the Seoul G20 or the Cannes G20, that it's time that all these leaders figure out that we either sink together or swim together. I'd like to hear a little more of that thought, really, and particularly as it does connect with the fact that all these G20 countries that we're talking about, 80% of the world's GDP, the leaders in all of these fields, and yet, as Alok puts it, are not really putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to the G20 forum.
Thanks, Vasni, and thanks, Bhanu, for inviting me here, giving me this opportunity and connecting with, as what Vasni said, G2, the next generation. And I think the big difference between you there and us, at least, not him, is not perhaps Hari either, is that we had grown up in the world looking at the world as us and them, because they were there and we were here, and this was the world that was divided, and the them were the former colonial powers, or the sort of the imperialist powers, it was Pax Americana or Pax Britannica, etc. And so they were there, and we had to be getting together to sort of find our space to develop and grow. And that's just completely changed. By the time when you were growing up, it's not us and them, we're all in it together, as I think the famous song by Tom Lehrer said. So I mean, this is we're going to sort of, and that, I think, from the Greece example has come out very well, that this world no more can be divided between different spaces where we can grow separately from the others and be isolated. And I think G20 is a manifestation of that. Essentially, it's a manifestation of that. I think it's important to recognize that it grew up in the post 1998 Asian crisis as a forum where the American president could harangue the finance ministers and central bank governors of the developing economies to say how poorly they have managed their economies, which has caused the Asian crisis. And that's the beginning of G20. You must remember that. And and the Canadians were very much in the forefront. And by the time it came to the 2007-8, the whole thing had changed, and therefore there were the emerging economies telling telling those guys, saying that, look, what have you done? So I think G20 reflects that new emergence of a new club, if you like, where the attempt is to reflect the new reality of the global economics, which is saying that the E12, as I call them, the emerging economies, 12 emerging economies today probably provide 80% of the GDP growth in the world, which was just completely the different. These are the 12. So that's, I think, so that's one reflection. And the second is that historically, if you notice, at the end of the 18th century, 19th century, 1800 something or the other, when Japan and Germany were growing, England and France refused to bring them on the governing, on the high table of global governance, and that resulted in a terrible 20th century first half. And this is now the sort of latter half of the 20th century, the beginning of 21st century. We are seeing the emergence of China, and that is, and it's a completely different league. And I think the effort is to bring China onto the governing, the high table, global high table, but to bring it on its own will probably not look legitimate or not look all right. So therefore, a larger formation has to be created, which is the G20, whereby India, which is 1/4 of China, and we must never forget that. And I go at long lengths to say that India and China are not in the same league, but nonetheless, the world wants to treat us like that. So India has to be brought in, and therefore everybody else has to be brought in. So this is the G20 is an effort to change the configuration of the high table, the global high table. Therefore, we can get a conversation rather than get a breakdown between us and them again, which will then be resolved only antagonistically, because the new world does not permit that. The new world does not permit that. So you see, this is in my view the historical genesis of G20, in which we used to understand that, and this is what Alok said, I think, which is that you could see it as a historical process. And what he said is that it will take a long time before the rules of the game, before the common understanding, before the common idiom, the language will get established between old established players, which are the G8, and the new guys, which are the E12. And that will then require a new idiom, dialogue, understanding, framework, reference points. And this takes a lot of time to emerge. But it takes a lot of time to emerge even with the best will in the town. And the question is whether the G20 members today have that will to create this historical formation and to take advantage of that opportunity. And I think that is where we need to focus our attention. Whether the two sides, the G8 on one and E12 on the other, have it within them the political will, the desire, and the capability to create a new dialogue, to create a new reference, and are we talking in those terms. Now here, I think it's extremely important for us in India to say that one, we, as I said, we, given our share in world trade, given our share in the world economy, given our own domestic concerns and problems, etc., can we or should we take a leading role in creating this new dialogue? Now, on the basis of material and objective conditions, one would tend to sort of conclude that India should better be a free rider in all of this, because you've got too many things at home to do this. But on the other hand, given our if you like, intellectual acumen, given our enterprising nature, given our negotiating capabilities, etc., it may be a good thing at the moment to try and play if you like, a role larger than life to bring about this historical change, which will then afford India a much more prominent place on the high table, which will then bring us benefits to our own domestic concerns and our position in the global community. I think that's for me, let me put it to you that I think for you guys, it's extremely important to get engaged in the G20, engaged in the world as it is emerging today, because when you grow up tomorrow, you will see that people will expect you to play a much more responsible role in the world affairs than we have been able to play. So I think this is an opportunity. Now, just to very quickly, the G20 at the moment can either be treated as a fire brigade or as the maintenance department of global economic order. Fire brigade in the sense that when there is fire, there is crisis, you call the summit, you say, come in, and the fire brigade comes, does something, it works, may not work. And then when the fire is over, what does the G20 do? Now, what naturally it should do is to make sure that the structural aspects of that building, the fire escapes, the routes, etc., are all in order. But that's boring, and it doesn't get you anywhere because everybody's got their own thing to do. I think we need to focus on how to make G20 a better, effective maintenance department of the global economy. So that's my first. The second thing is that is G20 today a formation in search of a purpose? Because at the moment it doesn't seem very clear amongst anybody that I notice, from President Obama to our own Prime Minister or the Chinese, whether they have agreed on this, whether they are agreed on whether you are a fire department, fire brigade, or a maintenance or whatever, and what are the rules. So I think that purpose has to be discovered, and I think the purpose would be discovered by let me just put it this way, that that you first and foremost, all those who are in G20 have to accept the legitimacy of the G20 to intervene in what could be considered as national issues. And so they must, like the UN has, like the G8 did, the members of the G8 agreed that the G8 had the legitimacy to intervene in their national interest, and it was therefore a supra-sovereign body to some extent. Now, G20 is not allowed that credible legitimacy so far, because when the Europe crisis happened, as Alok was telling us, the Europeans said, sorry, we're not going to discuss this in G20. This is none of your business. And having worked in the ADB, I've seen this happening so many times that the Japanese, who are the principal benefactors of the ADB, tell you ADB can only discuss the issues of the developing economies of Asia and not of Japan. Now, if that happens, then, so I think what we need to do in G20 is India and other countries must say that, look, either we are here for everybody or we are not here. Let's just go home and sit ourselves. So that's the second thing is the effectiveness of G20. Where does that come from? It doesn't have a secretariat. It doesn't have any, ongoing phenomena, a sort of practice, and therefore the credibility of the G20. It has notched up no successes so far. If you look at it dispassionately, what has G20 achieved? Even averting the crisis of 2008, Alok sort of was skeptical about it. But beyond that, very often people, and there is a FT correspondent, Clive Crooks, I think, and who sort of said, zilch. If you look at the scoreboard, it is 0. So you got to notch up some successes. And I therefore suggest to you 3 things that you could focus on. One, I think you could focus on agriculture, because it is hugely important. It was taken up in Cannes. It is something that we are which affects the poorest of the poor. And why can't G20 focus on ensuring agriculture becoming a globally negotiated phenomena and reaching to better food security issues? I'll get into the details, but it's terribly important that we get that agriculture thing. The second issue is environment, and where there is just one issue, let me just focus on, which is that there are huge amounts of technologies that are now emerging in the world, which can mitigate, ameliorate, help to get better environment. But all of these are coming with a price tag. Why can't G20 develop an agenda which says these are technologies that we consider to be in the public domain, because 99% of them are financed by public resources. Environment is a global public good which will affect all of us. So guys, why don't we use the G20 forum to talk about transferring these technologies free of charge to those where they matter most, which is in the developing economies. So why should the Indian entrepreneur have to pay huge amounts of price for carbon sequestration if you've got a technology which can help it, because you're going to get affected by it as we are. In any case, you are responsible for doing all of that in any case. So TOT, transfer of appropriate technologies for climate environment mitigation, is a second issue that I think we should focus on. And third, I think, which has not happened so far in G20, and which is where I'm speaking from where I am, is that G20 has become a process entirely for the government, by the government, of the government. There's no connect with either it's just beginning to be, there's a B20 thing that they had in Cannes, etc., and Seoul it started, but still is very much on the sideline. Somehow, and you've seen this in WTO, you've seen this in other negotiations, etc., unless the private sector comes to the center stage of any global process, it doesn't get the oomph that it needs to have. So therefore, what you need to do is to make the private sector, the entrepreneurs, the businesses, the ordinary farmer, the small and medium enterprise, as the center stage of the concerns of the G20, because if that doesn't happen, the new emerging order will not be discussed. So I think and this, just by the way, let me end there, that if you do that, then maybe G20 will play a much better role, much more effective role in achieving the promise of globalization, which was convergent growth, and which has not happened. The globalization in the last 40 years has produced divergent growth, both across nations and within countries. And that is why it is becoming illegitimate. Everybody is questioning globalization. Why can't G20 say that we will work with the private sector to produce more convergent, more employment intensive, more equitable growth? Because you can do it only through the private sector, you can't do it through the state sector. And if you do that, then G20 will get a new breath of life. Otherwise, I'm afraid it will be like the fire brigade. It will be closed until the next fire strikes you, and then it might be too late. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Rajiv. You've ended on that downer, but in fact, you're quite optimistic when you think that the fire brigade won't have to put out fires for the next few years, because I think what the economic crisis is showing is it's still eluding that that final douse out of all the flames. I do want to come to our next speaker, but I want to just ask you, when you spoke about the fact that the G20 needs to make itself more relevant, and I'm only a political scientist in comparison to all of you. The question would be, if the G20 in fact is only a forum that really brings together the world's finances. If, as someone said after the Cannes disaster, if I can call it that, where they were unable to really come up with any answer to the Eurozone crisis, it's only full of leaders. I'm just quoting from one of the Guardian editorials. The G20 has proved that its leaders are strong in only one sense. Each is powerful enough to veto another's idea of how to extricate themselves from the crisis. If that is the fact, and we already have living examples of the UN Security Council that are grappling with other issues. The UN as a body does seem to look at social agendas as well. Why continue it even now?
Well, you got to continue with G20 because, as I said, that's the only game in town which will help you to grapple with this whole historical issue of how to accommodate emerging powers in the global governance. So because to bring them into it, you see, because you see, otherwise they can play truant, and they may say that we don't want to play by the rules that you set for ourselves. You see, which is what has happened, which is that in the post-Second World War period, which is Pax Americana, you first had a Cold War, whereby you had a huge chunk of the world outside that. And then after 1990, you got a situation where you got a G8 where Russia was brought in. And you got the G8 framing the rules of how the global economy, the global polity, the global thing will work. Now here you got a China, which has been growing at 9%, 10%. Now the second largest economy, the largest exporter, saying that we will play this game by our own rules, and they are playing it. Now, which is causing a huge amount of stress, in the world. So how do you bring it in, into the now the thing could be that one could say that, look, you could do that through the UN system, but the UN system, and there is this amazing trade-off you're a political scientist, you would know much better than I am, this amazing trade-off between representation and effectiveness. If you get universal representation as you get in the UN, you get zero effectiveness. So you need a smaller forum than the universal 212 country fora that you got there. So which is why the search for a fora like G20. So which is why you need it. Now the question, however, becomes is that when you are there, are you willing to engage in a more, in a sort of more constructive interaction? Or do you still use the G20, as you said, either to veto each other or to only talk at each other? which is what happens at the moment as far as I can see. And this is where I have been actually arguing for some time that a smaller formation would have been much more effective, a G8 plus 5, which is what Alok said there was the Hellingen Dam process, which has now been completely overtaken by everything. But if you've got this G20, I think this is where countries like India and maybe, India, Brazil, South Africa, which are the intermediate powers, and not the Chinas and the US and the Japans of the world, maybe they can form a coalition to push an intellectual agenda forward, which will make it a more effective maintenance department, rather than what's happening today.
Well, certainly we do need to still discuss BRICS, which is one such intermediate fora. Our next speaker is Nisha Agarwal. She's the CEO of Oxfam. And interestingly, Oxfam's report just last month should have woken all of us up, talking about the inequalities in G20 countries. Now, the fact is nobody doubts that there are inequalities, but the fact that despite increase in prosperity, the inequalities in fact have increased, have not decreased, was something their report certainly brought out. And I do want to add, if you can bring in there, since we are talking about G20 and India, is it time to really take a very long, hard look at India? I was I was moderating a panel discussion for a show of mine between Tom Friedman and Nandan Nilekani. And there was a point at which I was actually saying, but India is this on the Human Development Index, this is where we are. And we can talk about India being a great new market. It can be a great demand driver in many ways for the world, but is it anything more than that? And eventually it was Tom who turned around and, sort of practically fired me up and said, well, if you can't get excited about the India story, I can, and the world is excited. But is that a false excitement? That's really the question I want to ask, that in seeing India as possibly one of the only future markets for the world, is the world really putting a gloss on the situation in terms of India's place in the G20 particularly?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. At Oxfam, we are working on what we say our ultimate aim is to see everybody lead a life with dignity, irrespective of national boundaries as well as of any other kind of identity on caste, religion, and so on. And one of the areas that we're trying to work to create that kind of a dream world is to really engage with young people. Last year, we had an Oxfam International Youth Parliament for the first time in India, where we brought together 500 young people from 100 different countries. People who had been identified as potential leaders, who wanted to bring about change in their communities. And then, since then, we've been following up with them to see them realize their dreams and actually work at the community level around the globe to bring about that kind of change. And we're very pleased that you have this initiative here where people are taking an interest not just in what is happening within our national boundaries, but really India's role in the global fora. And this is a very important topic today of looking at G20, and it's really great to be here. I think the question that you put to us is really the right one, and I just want to explain why I stepped out. It was for an interview with BBC Radio on this whole furor, which captures very well this issue. Who are we? On aid, as you might know, we've just sold, or we're buying rather, some planes for the military from France. And basically what this has led to is some members of parliament in the UK saying, oh, we were giving aid to India because we were expecting to get this deal, and now that we are no longer getting this trade deal, why should we bother to provide aid to India? And they've dug out our finance minister's old statement from 2 years ago that he made in the parliament, and they were saying this is a reaction to this commentary, that India no longer needs aid from anybody. We are rich, we are there, we've arrived, we are in G20, and this is peanuts, this amount of money. So they were saying, why did your finance minister react like that? I said, firstly, he didn't react. You guys have pulled out an old statement which has nothing to do with this deal. And secondly, we need aid. We need to be a member of the global community. Yes, but you will always find this dichotomy that we are two Indias. There's a part that has benefited really well from our growth story, that is doing well, and that now has a very thin skin. I mean, they want to portray India in Davos and everywhere else as this real superpower, and don't want it, to be, the pride gets hurt when you say we are taking aid. We'd rather be seen as a giver of aid and a giver of things and no longer think we need anything. On the other hand, we have this other half, and it's exactly half. It's not some tiny proportion of 456 million people who are living below $1.25 a day. For the first time in the history of humankind, we have 1 billion people going to bed hungry in the whole world, out of which 250 million people are in India. We're talking about hunger. We're not talking about, consumption and labor and migration and other things, just that word that we don't like to use anymore. Oxfam came to India in 1951. We are marking 60 years of our history in India. We came in response to the Bihar famine.